It was exactly 2:00 a.m. when the world changed forever. No sirens, no warnings, no thunderclap in the sky, just a single flickering light inside a morgue in Kharkiv. That should have stayed still, but didn't. The night shift technician would later be listed as the first confirmed casualty of what would become known as Zombie World War III. But no one knew that then. No one understood what they were seeing. Not yet. The clock simply struck 2 a.m., and humanity's final 24 hours of normalcy came to an end. The room was cold, sterile, quiet. A body male mid-30s lay zipped inside a black plastic bag labeled with the time of death. 23:14. Massive cardiac arrest. The technician was filling out paperwork, half asleep, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. Then he heard it, a soft, irregular tap from inside the storage tray. He paused, listened. Nothing. He resumed writing. Then the corpse exhaled. Not a gasp, not a moan, just one long, slow release of air, as though something deep inside lungs that should not function was waking up. The technician reached for the zipper, thinking it was simply trapped air. What emerged instead was a hand cold, stiff, bone white grabbing his wrist with impossible strength. The security camera caught only a blur, a violent jerk, and the crash of a steel tray hitting the ground. 37 seconds later, the technician's body went still, and then began to move again. The outbreak had begun. Across the continent, in Warsaw, Polish border guards monitoring infrared surveillance picked up abnormal heat signatures, moving through the forests near the Belarusian frontier. At first, it looked like animal steer, maybe, but the signatures were too warm, too fast, too erratic. Guards zoomed in, watching shapes sprinting through dense trees as though branches were no obstacle at all. The first guard to see it reportedly whispered, code jest. "What is that?" before the creature lunged from the tree line and slammed into the border fence with enough force to shake the ground. Within minutes, more figures appeared. Dozens, then hundreds. The Polish 21st Podhale Rifles Brigade was placed on alert, but no one understood what they were responding to. Intelligence reports were contradictory. Some said it was a Belarusian infiltration. Others speculated drug-induced rioters fleeing an unknown conflict. No one dared to say it looked like the dead running. In Kyiv, paramedics were dealing with something equally inexplicable. A woman who had died en route to the hospital suddenly bolted upright on the gurney, snapping the restraints, lunging at the medic with such ferocity that he fell down the ambulance steps. His partner tried to wrestle her back inside, but her body moved with inhuman strength and no sense of injury or pain. She tore out of the vehicle and disappeared into the darkened street, vanishing into a narrow alley before officers arrived. At the same moment, 07 a.m., thousands of kilometers away in Manila General Hospital, 3 patients in critical condition suddenly flatlined. The medical staff tried to revive them, but within seconds of being declared dead, all 3 reanimated simultaneously. Orderlies attempted to restrain them, but one of the infected bit straight through a nurse's forearm, tearing out muscle with horrifying force. Panic spread through the ward as the infected began attacking anyone nearby. A senior nurse pulled the fire alarm, but the shrill ringing only attracted more reanimated patients from the ICU. The halls became slaughterhouses. By 2:15 a.m., something was clear. The phenomenon was global. In Baghdad, American soldiers stationed at the Al-Muthina air base radioed an emergency request for reinforcements after a corpse in the medical wing stood up without a pulse. The U.S. Army medics on duty attempted to restrain it, but the body broke both of a corporal's wrists before 3 soldiers fired M4 rifles point-blank into its chest. It didn't fall until one bullet struck the skull. The medic who witnessed it said the creature didn't feel fear or hesitation or pain, just a relentless drive to bite, tear, and infect. At 2:23 a.m. MNORA detected mass civilian movement across multiple cities, people running, not walking, caught on thermal satellites. Traffic cameras across Chicago, Istanbul, Rio de Janeiro, and Johannesburg showed individuals sprinting at 30 to 40 kilometers per hour, weaving between cars like predators chasing prey. Dispatches were overwhelmed with reports of rabid attackers. People foaming at the mouth, faces that looked dead, and bodies that wouldn't die. The truth was forming, but it was so unthinkable that no government dared say it. For a few more precious minutes, the world clung to denial. By 2:30 a.m., the first coordinated military responses began. In Ukraine, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade deployed armed patrols around Kharkiv. After 3 separate morgues reported missing bodies, soldiers expected looters. What they found instead were corpses sprinting down dimly lit roads, jaws snapping in the cool night air. The first platoon that engaged them tried using warning shots. The infected didn't even flinch. They kept charging, unstoppable unless their brains were destroyed. When the soldiers radioed the behavior back to command, the response was disbelief. Repeat. Say again. But the soldiers had no words that made sense, just the sound of gunfire and screams. Meanwhile, in New York City, the Q train was pulling into 34th Street Herald Square when a commuter slumped to the ground. Strangers gathered around him, believing he had fainted. Then he sat up with a broken neck, head twisted unnaturally, and lunged at the closest person. The security footage would later become one of the most infamous recordings of the outbreak. The moment chaos reached America. In the cramped train car, panic spread like fire. The infected commuter bit 3 passengers before the doors opened. Those bitten would turn minutes later. Manhattan was already lost, and almost no one knew. By 2:45 a.m., the infection had doubled. Then doubled again. Reports from São Paulo described mobs tearing through residential blocks. In Frankfurt, emergency responders answering calls about heart attacks were attacked by the very victims they attempted to revive. In Sydney, joggers on Bondi Beach fled from a man who emerged from the surf, pale and shuddering, sprinting after them with animalistic precision. No one knew how he died. No one cared. He infected 14 people before police brought him down. The pattern was clear: speed, aggression, and no reaction to pain. These were not slow, shambling creatures from old fiction. These were weapons biomechanical nightmares, relentless and fast. At exactly 2:52 a.m., a British Army intelligence officer monitoring global feeds whispered the words no one wanted to hear. This is coordinated. This is deliberate. The implication was devastating. Someone or something had ignited the outbreak in multiple countries at once. Zombie World War III had begun. By 3 a.m., the second hour started, and the infection crossed the threshold where containment was no longer possible. People were still trying to make sense of it. Some thought it was terrorism. Some thought it was a new synthetic drug. Others believed it was mass hysteria. But the military units on the ground, those in the dark streets of Kharkiv, the forests of Poland, the metro tunnels of New York knew better. They saw the dead acting with purpose. In Lublin, Polish soldiers fired on a swarm of infected charging through a wheat field. Their night vision goggles illuminated dozens, no, hundreds of figures moving in perfect lines, as if driven by instinct rather than disorder. Bullets tore through torsos, arms, legs, but the infected kept running. Only headshots brought them down. Even then, they fell mid-stride, collapsing in silence, while others vaulted over their bodies. Across the ocean, in Los Angeles, the first 911 calls began around 3:05 a.m. A woman reported her husband acting possessed, smashing through a locked bedroom door with blood dripping from his mouth. Back in New York, police cruisers swarmed Times Square, responding to frantic calls, but officers could barely step out of their vehicles before being overwhelmed. The infected moved with horrifying accuracy, lunging at faces, ripping through Kevlar, biting through layers of clothing. One officer radioed, voice trembling, "Headshots only, nothing else works." His transmission was cut off by a wet, choking scream. By 3:15 a.m., the CDC's internal network showed that whatever this pathogen was, it spread through bites and blood contact almost instantly. The onset of symptoms took less than 5 minutes. Death followed quickly. Reanimation followed death. The system flagged it as a Category 5 biological event, the highest level. But the message reached almost no one. Communications were already breaking. In Tokyo, commuters waited patiently for morning trains, unaware that in the tunnels below them, a single infected maintenance worker was sprinting through the dark, turning anyone he encountered. Surveillance caught hundreds of people running as one, trying to escape the underground labyrinth. The screams echoed through the station vents long before police arrived. In Johannesburg, gunfire cracked through the night as residents tried to defend their homes. In Buenos Aires, people smashed through supermarkets and pharmacies, desperate to escape whatever was stalking the streets. In Moscow, the Russian National Guard deployed armored vehicles to block major roads. Soldiers aimed rifles into the night, unsure what they were supposed to shoot at. By 3:30 a.m., every continent had confirmed aggressive reanimation. Every continent, except Antarctica. For a few brief moments, the world was united by one feeling: terror. Governments still didn't know the scope. They didn't know the origin. They didn't know how fast it was spreading. But they understood one thing with absolute certainty. This was not an outbreak. It was an invasion. A biological war against the living. The first 2 hours had passed. The infection was now accelerating beyond control. By the time the clock struck 3 a.m., humanity was already behind. Governments were reacting to shadows, phone calls, scattered reports of violent assailants and unresponsive attackers. But by 3:01, the truth could no longer be soft or disguised. It was now visible in the streets, illuminated by headlights, street lamps, and burning buildings. The dead were everywhere, and they were moving fast. The second wave had begun. The infection was accelerating, spreading in tightly packed metropolitan centers like wildfire. In New York, every subway tunnel became a death trap. In London, where the bars had only recently closed, thousands of drunken pedestrians staggered through the West End, unaware that a reanimated body had just torn through a paramedic on Shaftesbury Avenue. In Hong Kong, a single infected taxi driver had already passed through 3 districts, leaving dozens of bitten passengers and pedestrians behind. The world was slipping. At 3:07 a.m., the first military counteroffensive took place in Ukraine. The 93rd Mechanized Brigade, already mobilized from earlier reports, began firing controlled bursts at infected swarms, advancing through a residential block outside The soldiers expected fear or hesitation, or at least pain. They got nothing. The creatures charged through a hail of gunfire, their bodies absorbing bullets like rain. Only headshots stopped them, and most soldiers, untrained for such a precise target under pressure, missed more often than they hit. One lieutenant radioed command with a trembling voice, insisting the infected were not human anymore. Command told him to hold the line. 60 seconds later, most of his platoon was dead. The outbreak in Eastern Europe was no longer containable. It was metastasizing. At 3:10 a.m., air bases across NATO activated rapid response protocols. F-16s in Poland, scrambled U.S. Blackhawks lifted off from bases in Germany, Italy, and Romania. Surveillance drones swarmed the skies, trying to map the movement patterns of the infected. But the results were horrifying. On the monitors, infected civilians could be seen sprinting down highways, scaling fences, smashing car windows with bare hands. Some were still wearing hospital gowns. Others were drenched in blood from previous victims. They were moving together, not as a coordinated unit, but drawn by noise, light, motion, anything living. The algorithms attempting to calculate infection growth collapsed. The numbers were increasing too fast to predict. At 3:15 a.m., France made the first official declaration of a national emergency. President Lefebvre was rushed into a bunker beneath Paris as the Gendarmerie Nationale reported outbreaks in Marseille, Lyon, Toulouse, and the northern suburbs of Paris itself. What began as isolated attacks turned into mass casualties within minutes. Entire apartment blocks were overrun before dawn. In the heart of Paris, near the Bastille metro, 2 officers emptied their pistols into an infected man who kept running toward them until a final shot shattered its skull. One officer, shaken, whispered, "Mon Dieu, il est digi. More than my God." He was already dead. At 3:22 a.m., the first hospitals fell. In São Paulo, Santa Casa Hospital was completely silent, except for the alarms and the tearing of flesh. Medical staff were the first overwhelmed. They were bitten while trying to save patients, infected before they even realized what was happening. Entire wings collapsed in minutes. Security cameras showed groups of infected barreling down hallways at impossible speeds, legs snapping and reforming, bones splintering with every step, yet somehow still functional. It wasn't biology. It was something else, something built for one purpose alone: spreading. And it spread beautifully. By 3:30 a.m., the infection had breached its 6th global megacity. Johannesburg, Moscow, Bangkok, Chicago, Madrid, Delhi. In Delhi, a recently deceased man in a traffic accident sat up on the asphalt, ignoring broken ribs and a collapsed lung, and attacked the officers that had come to cover his body. Passersby recorded it on their phones, thinking it was a bizarre anomaly. Within 10 minutes, the footage was viral. Within 15, the same street was flooded with infected bodies, sprinting toward fleeing civilians. Delhi's population density turned it into a perfect ignition point. At 3:37 a.m., the United States military made its first formal move. Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, Fort Benning, and Camp Pendleton all went into maximum readiness. The 82nd Airborne Division was ordered to prepare for rapid deployment to major outbreak zones in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. But before orders could be fully issued, the Pentagon received a catastrophic message. The New York Police Department was no longer responding radio silenci. No officers on dispatch, no tactical units, no emergency response vehicles. The country's most populated city had fallen. 3:40 a.m. brought the first terrifying sign that the infection was something more advanced than a natural mutation. In Warsaw, medical examiners reported corpses reanimating after hours of death. No fresh oxygen, no functioning organs, no apparent brain activity. Some bodies were cold to the touch, rigor mortis still present, yet still rising and sprinting with animal ferocity. Even more disturbing, many retained a portion of their sensory smell, hearing, but only in ways that benefited the infection spread. They could see motion. They could hear the faintest sound. Some could smell blood from blocks away. Human senses, it seemed, were no longer serving humans. At 3:50 a.m., Beijing went dark. The official explanation was a technical blackout. But satellite images told another story. Massive plumes of heat signatures, tens of thousands, were detected flowing through the streets. The infected moved like rivers, colliding, splitting, merging again. People trapped in high-rise apartments flashed lights in desperation. Others tried to escape on foot, only to be consumed by the tidal wave below. When Beijing stopped transmitting, panic rippled through other governments. If a city of over 20 million could disappear in less than an hour, then what chance did anyone else have? By 4 a.m., the 4th hour dawned with no sunlit, only firelight. The first attempts at containment had failed. The first emergency responses had been overwhelmed. The infection was no longer a series of isolated horrors. It was a synchronized global collapse. The U.S. president was escorted to the underground command center beneath Washington, D.C. The British Prime Minister was flown to a fortified bunker in Northumberland. Leaders across the world began activating continuity protocols originally designed for nuclear war. The difference was that nuclear war had a clear enemy. These one did. The infection had no demands, no negotiations, no ideology. It hust spread. By 4:10 a.m., scientists in Geneva and Atlanta finally had enough data to classify the pathogen. The dead were reanimating with complete severance from their higher brain functions. Only the brainstem responsible for primal instincts remained active. Bite victims turned in minutes. Death was almost guaranteed. Reanimation followed rapidly. The infection wasn't a virus in the traditional sense. It behaved more like a hijacker rewiring the brain, overriding the body, pushing it beyond natural limits. Muscle fibers that should tear simply didn't. Joints that should dislocate stayed intact. Pain receptors were gone, replaced with a single biological imperative: seek, attack, infect. This wasn't evolution. It was weaponization. At 4:18 a.m., NATO received an impossible report. A group of infected had sprinted 6 miles in under 7 minutes in a rural area of eastern Slovakia. Thermal drones captured the footage blurs of heat racing across fields faster than most animals. Scientists were forced to conclude the pathogen boosted oxygen efficiency far beyond natural human limits. The infected were no longer bound by human capabilities. They were transforming. By 4:30 a.m., firestorms burned across several cities. Smoke plumes rose over Istanbul. Gunfire echoed through Mexico City. Highways in Los Angeles were gridlocked with fleeing civilians, their cars crawling forward in panic while infected sprinted between them. Dashcam footage captured the horror shadows darting, bodies slamming into windshields, hands clawing at windows as people screamed from inside their vehicles. The world was still awake, still aware, still losing. At 4:45 a.m., a chilling realization spread through the military intelligence community. The infected were clustering, not communicating, not in any human sense, but following sound waves. Movement, vibrations, small hordes merged into bigger ones. Bigger ones merged into massive swarms. By dawn, some cities would face tens of thousands, moving as one mass, and nothing, humanity, could stop something like that. At 5 a.m., 3 hours after the outbreak began, the global infection crossed its first billion potential vectors. A billion. In 3 hours, zombie World War III was no longer a metaphor. It was the final war, and humanity was losing every battle. By the time the clock struck 6 a.m., the sun was rising over a planet that no longer resembled the one that had existed the night before. Smoke plumes stretched across horizons, casting long shadows over cities that were once alive with morning routines. Streets that should have been filled with commuters and school children now echoed only with distant screams. Gunfire, and the relentless pounding of infected feet sprinting across pavement. The 6th hour marked a turning point. No country, no matter how wealthy or militarily powerful, could deny the reality anymore. Emergency broadcasts blared across radios and televisions worldwide, though most signals were already unstable, flickering in and out as infrastructure collapsed. Those who managed to tune in heard the same message repeated in trembling voices. Stay indoors. Lock all doors. Do not attempt to approach the infected. Headshots only. But for millions, those warnings came far too late. At 6:12 a.m., satellite imagery revealed a horrifying pattern spreading across Eastern Europe. The infected were moving like rivers, fast, chaotic, but always flowing toward sources of human density. Villages were swallowed whole. Towns became silent ruins in minutes. In the span of a single hour, over 300,000 people in the region were either dead or reanimated. In Kiju, firefighters attempting to rescue trapped civilians found themselves surrounded by dozens of sprinting infected who tore through their protective gear as if it were thin cloth. The city's emergency services collapsed in less than 4 hours. The Ukrainian military, already exhausted from containing early outbreaks, began falling back in disorganized waves, abandoning checkpoints, bridges, and entire districts. Soldiers were ordered to regroup in defensible positions and conserve ammunition. There was no front line. The front line was everywhere. At 6:30 a.m., the infection struck Tokyo with apocalyptic force. Shinjuku Station, normally the busiest transit hub on Earth, became a vortex of panic. Hundreds of thousands of commuters were packed shoulder to shoulder when the first infected man staggered into the central concourse, blood dripping down his chin. When he lunged at a young woman beside him, it triggered a stampede so violent that dozens were trampled in seconds. But the infected did not trample. They hunted. They leaped onto fallen bodies, tearing flesh in broad daylight as thousands screamed and surged toward exits that were already clogged. Police officers attempted to form barricades near the junior platforms, but the infected moved through the crowd with terrifying efficiency, sprinting along the tops of vending machines, vaulting over railings, chasing prey with single-minded determination. Within 20 minutes, Shinjuku was lost. Uitin, and our Tokyo itself, was collapsing. At 6:45 a.m., the first U.S. National Guard battalions reached New York City. What they found was not a population awaiting rescue, it was a battlefield. Smoke from burning taxis drifted across Midtown as infected bodies thrashed against barricades set up by civilians overnight. Times Square looked like a war zone. Overturned police cars, shattered windows, human silhouettes sprinting between flames, and infected figures hurling themselves against anything that moved. The 69th Infantry Regiment, one of the oldest units in American history, engaged the infected head-on, but even with automatic rifles, mortars, and armored vehicles, the soldiers struggled. The infected were too fast, too numerous, too relentless. They swarmed Humvees, climbed onto armored carriers, smashed faces against reinforced glass until the pressure cracked it. By 7:10 a.m., the National Guard realized the horrible truth. New York was unsalvageable. The only outcome now was evacuation, but the bridges were already clogged with abandoned vehicles, their engines still running, their owners nowhere in sight. The evacuation became a massacre. At 7:20 a.m., Paris fell. Not with a single catastrophic event, but with dozens happening simultaneously. Apartment blocks breached, metro tunnels overrun, gendarmerie units overwhelmed. The Eiffel Tower, still standing in the early morning light, cast a long shadow over streets filled with Beaudesèvres, living and dead. Soldiers from the 2nd Foreign Parachute Regiment had attempted to hold the lines near the Metro Republic station, but a swarm of over 800 infected burst from the tunnels and overran them in minutes. Radio traffic captured the last transmission from the station. "They're not people. They're not people. Fall back, then silence." Paris remained silent for the rest of the day. At 7:35 a.m., Russia activated its perimeter Marshall Protocol, normally reserved for nuclear conflict. The Russian Airborne Forces, the VDV, deployed helicopter gunships across Moscow. Mi-24s strafed infected swarms racing through the garden ring, their rotors whipping through the morning air as pilots fired rockets into malls, parking garages, office buildings, anywhere the creatures gathered. It wasn't enough. The infected were too many. One swarm, estimated at 16,000, poured across Tverskia Street, moving like a seismic wave. They crashed through barricades, smashed through armored personnel carriers, and chased civilians into subway stations. The tunnels became their hunting grounds. Moscow, a city of over 12 million, lost control by 8 a.m. At 8:10 a.m., Beijing's blackout was finally explained. Footage from a surviving surveillance drone showed what had happened. Infected swarms had climbed skyscrapers not using ladders or stairs, but by clawing into the sides of buildings, scaling them with wild, frantic movements. They smashed through windows on the 40th, 50th, even 60th floors. People who believed they were safe in high-rise apartments found themselves ambushed from above. This was not behavior ever documented in any organism resembling a human. Scientists watching the footage whispered in disbelief. "This isn't viral. This is engineered." But engineered by who, or by what? No answers came. By 8:30 a.m., the infection had reached the outskirts of Madrid. Spanish emergency forces attempted to establish a defensive perimeter near the A2 highway, but the infected surged toward the city center from multiple directions at once like converging rivers. Soldiers from the Spanish Legion opened fire with heavy machine guns, mowing down dozens. But the infected simply climbed over the bodies of their fallen, using them as ramps. One soldier, in disbelief, shouted, "No es posible. No es posible. It's not possible." But it was. Madrid fell before noon. At 9 a.m., India reached its breaking point. Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, cities with populations in the tens of millions, were overwhelmed by the sheer speed of transmission. Roads became oceans of panicked humanity, with thousands sprinting in every direction as infected poured through alleyways and markets. The Indian Army deployed armored columns through the cities, but even tanks struggled. Some infected threw themselves under treads, sacrificing their bodies to create blockages that slowed the armored vehicles. Others leaped onto the tanks, clawing at viewing ports, smashing cameras. The ancient cities became modern graveyards as the 6th hour melted into the 7th and 8th. The world crossed several thresholds of horror. Electricity grids began to fail across multiple continents. Fuel shortages erupted as civilians fled in every direction, clogging highways with abandoned vehicles. Fire departments were overwhelmed and eventually stopped responding entirely. Airports, once hubs of civilization, became apocalyptic landscapes of overturned luggage carts, shattered windows, and thousands of passengers running for their lives, only to be overtaken by sprinting infected. The infection was now unstoppable. By 10 a.m., the U.S. military issued a final order. All major metropolitan evacuations are terminated. Redirect forces to defensible borders. The meaning was clear. Cities were no longer worth saving. Los Angeles was burning by 10:15 a.m. Infected sprinted along the Hollywood Walk of Fame, bodies streaked with blood, jaws snapping at anyone who emerged from hiding. Police helicopters circled above, but infected swarms entered buildings so quickly that pilots struggled to identify who was alive and who was already turned. By 11 a.m., the infection reached the edges of Washington, D.C. Soldiers fortified the Capitol, the White House, and the Pentagon. But the panic was spreading faster than the infection itself. Civilians clogged the streets, desperate for safety, unaware that the infected ran faster than any evacuation convoy could drive. At 12 p.m., the 12th hour global estimates showed that over 3 billion people were either dead, infected, or trapped behind collapsing lines. Nations were falling out of sync. Governments were losing contact with their own cities. Presidents and prime ministers were communicating through satellite phones, begging for reinforcements no one could send. Humanity was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to stall the inevitable. By the 12th hour, when the world should have been settling into its afternoon routines, normalcy had already died. Cities that had stood for hundreds, even thousands of years were now nothing more than mazes of smoke, blood, and ruined architecture. Nations were losing contact with themselves. Entire governments were functioning through emergency backup satellite phones, underground bunkers, hastily assembled crisis councils. The surface of the earth was no longer a place for leaders. It belonged to swarms. At 12:05 p.m., the first major government officially broke. Italy declared national structural collapse, the bleakest designation in its emergency manual, indicating that federal authority no longer controlled more than 30% of the territory. Rome had fallen hours earlier, its narrow streets becoming perfect traps where the infected overwhelmed soldiers and civilians alike. Helicopter footage showed Piazza Navona littered with bodies, infected sprinting around fountains, chasing anyone who tried to escape. By 12:20 p.m. Milan was overrun. The infection had moved through the city like a wildfire, spreading across plazas and shopping districts with terrifying speed. Armored vehicles from the Folgore Airborne Brigade tried to hold key intersections, but they were engulfed by thousands of infected sprinting from all directions down tram lines, across rooftops, through shattered storefronts. Even those inside the tanks were not safe. Some infected climbed onto the turrets and slammed their heads against viewing ports until the reinforced glass cracked from repeated impacts. Italy was gone. At 12:45 p.m., the infection struck South Korea with unprecedented aggression. Seoul had prepared. It had one of the most advanced crisis response infrastructures in the world. The government activated the National Crisis Management Center, mobilized military units, and deployed drones over the entire metropolitan region. And still, it wasn't enough. In the packed districts of Gangnam and Myeongdong, thousands attempted to flee at once. The narrow streets funneled panicked crowds into tight choke points, where even a handful of infected could devastate entire blocks. Drone footage captured a horrifying image over 100 infected sprinting along the Han River's edge, moving in perfect unison, their bodies jerking violently as they followed the sound of helicopters overhead. By the time the South Korean army secured defensive lines along major bridges, half the city was already overrun. At 1 p.m., London collapsed. It began with a breach at St. Thomas Hospital, where dozens of recently deceased patients reanimated simultaneously. They tore through doctors and visitors, storming down stairwells and bursting through the emergency exits into the streets. Runners fast, blood-soaked. Fearless spread into Westminster before the Metropolitan Police even understood what was happening. Parliament was evacuated within minutes. Members of government sprinted through tunnels beneath the Palace of Westminster as infected swarmed the streets above. The famous bells of Big Ben tolled over a city that was no longer alive. The sounds of gunfire echoed off the Thames as soldiers from the Household Division attempted to hold Lambeth Bridge. They were overwhelmed in less than 15 minutes. In the end, the British capital did not fall quietly. It fell violently, chaotically, screaming into the smoke-filled afternoon as tens of thousands of infected swept through the old stone streets. At 1:30 p.m., Washington, D.C. reached its tipping point. The U.S. government was still intact, but the city surrounding it was not. Checkpoints along Constitution Avenue collapsed under overwhelming force. Civilians packed into every conceivable evacuation route: bridges, freeways, bike lanes, sidewalks only to be blocked by abandoned vehicles or incoming hordes. The 3rd Infantry Regiment formed a defensive ring around the White House, while Marines fortified the Pentagon with sandbags and anti-vehicle barricades. But the skies above D.C. were already thick with smoke. Helicopters circled desperately, evacuating officials while infected hordes crashed against cordons outside like waves against sea. By 1:50 p.m., the president was flown to an undisclosed mountain facility thousands of miles away. For the first time in American history, the capital was declared a biological loss zone. At 2 p.m., the infection reached Cairo. The streets of the ancient city twisted and converged into chaotic arteries that fed millions into the same central corridors. The infected thrived. They sprinted through markets, crashed through wooden stalls, swarmed across rooftops, and clawed down anyone trapped between walls and crowds. The Egyptian armed forces attempted coordinated counterattacks with armored personnel carriers, but the sheer volume of infected made precision impossible. In Giza, the pyramids silent, immovable witnesses to thousands of years of history, overlooked a city drowning in blood and dust. By 2:30 p.m., the infection had expanded beyond dense cities. Suburbs, small towns, and rural landscapes were succumbing to the chaos. This was the first indication that humanity's survival odds were not tied to population density alone. Even low population areas were now falling, overwhelmed by hordes migrating outward from major cities in every direction. In France, infected sprinted through lavender fields in Provence, moving past old stone farmhouses in massive packs that stretched for kilometers. In Canada, they surged through quiet suburban streets outside Toronto and Montreal, bursting into homes, chasing survivors across snow-dusted lawns. In Australia, swarms cut through wheat fields like locusts, creating streaks of destruction visible from satellite images. It did not matter where people ran. The infected could always run faster. At 3 p.m., the 6th continent fell. South America, which had been battling sporadic outbreaks since the early hours, finally collapsed under the weight of an unstoppable cascade. Rio de Janeiro's favelas became labyrinths of infected. Buenos Aires faced simultaneous breaches across more than a dozen neighborhoods. Lima's historic center burned as soldiers retreated into the mountains. The Andes offered no refuge. Infected bodies climbed steep inclines with unnatural speed, scrambling over rocks on all fours like predatory animals. Nature no longer protected humanity. It amplified the terror. At 3:30 p.m., the global infection reached a point of no return. Satellite thermal scans detected mass formations, millions of heat signatures moving like migratory herds across continents. These swarms ignored oceans, deserts, mountains. They gathered in predictable patterns, converging toward the remaining pockets of human life. It was as though the pathogen had a purpose, a direction. Strategy. Scientists compared the global infection curve to a nuclear chain reaction. But this reaction didn't plateau, it soared, exponentially. In less than half a day, the world's surface had become dominated by infected movement. Civilization now existed in islands, isolated military bases, mountain bunkers, hidden rural pockets. The rest belonged to the dead. By 4 p.m., the world entered its 16th hour. That was when the screams began to fade, when the gunfire grew sporadic, when the cities stopped burning because there were no longer humans left to feed the flames. The infected did not stop running. They did not stop hunting, but their prey had grown scarce in many places. Humanity was shrinking into the cracks of the world. Governments were still speaking, command centers still functioning, satellites still observing, but the ground, the soil, the streets, the cities that belonged to the dead now. At 5 p.m., 18 hours into the first day, it became clear that this was no longer a battle. It was a countdown, a race against extinction. By the 18th hour, the world had entered a strange, unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a massacre, when the smoke is still rising but the fighting has already been lost. Cities that had been alive with screams, engines, and explosions only hours earlier were now filled with nothing but the crunch of broken glass beneath infected feet. Survivors described this period as the hour when hope finally died. Not because humanity stopped fighting, but because humanity finally understood the true scale of what it was fighting against. At 6 p.m., the sun dipped low over Europe. Shadows stretched across the ruins of Berlin, broken only by the movement of thousands of infected pouring down Unter den Linden. Smoke from government buildings drifted through the Brandenburg Gate like dark, ghostly mist. Earlier in the day, German forces had attempted to consolidate in the Tiergarten, turning the park into a massive defensive zone. But by evening, the lines had collapsed. The last radio transmission from the German Crisis Command Center was chillingly brief. Berlin is gone. Pull back to Bavaria. Re-establish the line at all costs. But there were no lines left to establish. Only pockets, scattered, surrounded, and shrinking by the second. At 6:20 p.m., the infection hit Moscow with catastrophic force. The Russian military had mobilized faster than almost any nation armored brigades rushing into the city. Airborne units dropping into contested districts, Med-28 helicopters sweeping the skies with heavy machine gun fire. For a brief moment, it looked like Moscow might hold, but the infected adapted. They surged through the metro tunnels in numbers that defied imagination. Entire subway lines became rivers of bodies, sprinting through the darkness and bursting out of stations into the heart of the city. Red Square turned into a battlefield of smoke and gunfire as thousands of infected charged across the cobblestones, slamming into barricades with inhuman strength. The Kremlin held until 6:47 p.m., then the gates broke, and Moscow disappeared beneath a wave of movement that no human force could stop. Across the world, daylight began to fade, and with the darkness came something far worse. As night fell, the infected moved faster, not physically. Psychologically, the darkness made them harder to see, harder to track, harder to anticipate. In rural areas, survivors described hearing the hordes before they saw them. The pounding footsteps, the guttural snarling, the crack of branches as hundreds of bodies tore through forests at impossible speeds. By 7 p.m., North America was a patchwork of collapsing urban centers and desperate defensive zones. San Diego burned along the coastline, its beaches covered in abandoned vehicles and military barricades swallowed by infected swarms. Phoenix fell in a single hour after multiple simultaneous breaches overwhelmed both civilian and military sectors. Denver became a refugee choke point, its highways jammed with tens of thousands of vehicles, many containing nothing but corpses. But the most critical battle was taking place far to the east, because Washington, D.C., even in ruin, still mattered. Even if the capital was lost, the government had not surrendered. The continuity plan was still alive. One final defensive line remained, a 200-mile perimeter across the Appalachian Mountains, fortified by combined U.S. Army and National Guard forces. It was here that the last organized military resistance in the eastern United States took shape. But the infected were coming. And they were coming fast. At 8 p.m., the largest concentration of infected on the planet began moving toward the mountains. Satellite scans revealed more than 2 million heat signatures pouring out of the ruins of the East Coast swarms from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, Norfolk, all converging toward the same point. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was coordinated. Something in the pathogen was pulling them toward the last major concentrations of human life. Like sharks scenting blood in the ocean, the infected moved with perfect, terrifying instinct. By 8:30 p.m., the Appalachian defensive line was bracing for a wave unlike anything in military history. The 10th Mountain Division fortified the peaks. The 82nd Airborne prepared for emergency drops. Armored units dug into the valleys and mountain passes, their silhouettes black against the fading sky. Civilians were rushed into underground fallout shelters built during the Cold War fortifications, never intended for the dead running above ground. And still, it felt like preparing for a storm that had already consumed half the world. At 9 p.m., the infection reached Africa's major capitals. Johannesburg fell in less than 40 minutes. Lagos fought for nearly 3 hours before its defensive lines disintegrated. Nairobi's police service was overwhelmed at the central station, its officers firing until their ammunition ran dry, then joining the hordes they had once tried to protect the city from. In the deserts of North Africa, the infected moved like sandstorms, fast, unpredictable, and unstoppable. They traveled along old caravan routes, across highways, through villages abandoned in haste. Entire regions went dark on satellite maps as electrical grids collapsed under the weight of panicked evacuations and destroyed infrastructure. There were no continents left untouched, only time zones waiting their turn to fall. At 10 p.m., the world reached a breaking point, not militarily, psychologically, because that was the moment when global communication finally fractured. Too many satellite stations destroyed, too many ground relays overrun, too many command centers lost. For the first time since the outbreak began, nations could no longer reliably speak to each other. Silence spread across the world, a silence that meant one thing: humanity was now alone, pocket by pocket, bunker by bunker, fighting in the dark with no knowledge of what was happening beyond the horizon. At 11 p.m., the Appalachian line faced its first wave. The infected hit, like a tidal surge, made of flesh and bone. Hundreds of thousands of bodies pouring through narrow valleys, over rocky cliffs, between trees that splintered under the weight of charging packs. Night vision goggles revealed a sea of movement, white-hot silhouettes, sprinting with impossible speed and coordination. Machine guns roared across the mountain passes. Artillery shells lit up the sky in orange bursts. Apaches tore through the darkness with their rotors chopping the night air, their hellfires ripping holes into the swarms. But the holes closed instantly. For every 100 infected cut down, 1,000 more surged behind them. By midnight, 24 hours since the first reanimation event, the front line had already been pushed back 3 kilometers. Medics worked frantically in makeshift shelters dug into the mountainside, treating soldiers for bites, broken bones, and exhaustion so severe that many collapsed before their wounds did. The dead pressed forward, the living staggered backward, and the earth trembled beneath millions of running feet. At 1 a.m., as the world entered the 25th hour, humanity faced a truth it had never imagined. This was no longer a global outbreak, no longer a crisis. It was a war, World War Z. And the first day was only the beginning.